Welcome to my channel, especially if you're a Star Trek fan, because for this video I'm going to explain the timeline as I've constructed it. Now, this is not the official chronology as established by Mike and Denise Okuda, published by Mike and Denise Okuda. This goes way back before that. Obviously, the 1960s show, came out in 1966. It aired from 1966 to 69, and then went through all the way through up until somewhere in the early 90s. There was a firming up. It seems a decision to establish an official canon. Not that there was not an official canon before that, but there were several books published around the early 90s and onwards, establishing that this is now canon, and we now have a book that details the chronology. And that book, it's called something like, I have it, Star Trek Chronology, A History of the Future, I think is the title of it. And then there's also a Star Trek Encyclopedia, which is thick and it's gone through at least a couple of volumes. Before that, it was looser. The canon itself, the timeline in the Star Trek universe, and the universe itself was sort of agreed upon and recognized by fans and production staff, but wasn't exactly fixed. So this is going to be fun. I had written something like this in the early 1990s after having seen the sixth film and the final film featuring the original Star Trek crew from the 1960s. The films after that were the ones from the Next Generation, and then there was some time after that, and then J.J. Abrams created his three Star Trek films, reboot films. But I want to go back, and I want to go to the very beginning and establish not only the timeline as I see it, simply based on the movies and TV series themselves, but also show you how things deviated. For example, it seems clear in the original series that it's set in the 22nd century. However, somewhere along the line, it shifted to the 23rd century, and then it'd been established canon that the original series took place in the 23rd century. Stuff like that. So I'm going to go back to the beginning, and I've written actual notes. This is not going to be a short video, okay? But anyway, after seeing the sixth film, as I recall, this was released December 1991. I wrote an essay in which I gave a very strong case for my version of the timeline, and I wasn't the only one. Star Trek fans being fascinated by trying to understand how Star Trek works and operates, and how the universe is, and the timeline and characters' biographies and so forth. They are really enthusiastic about doing this. So there was a magazine called Trek Magazine, and I found out about it because when Star Trek 4 came out, and I had become that was the point where I was becoming a real Star Trek fan. Not that I had not seen episodes before or movies before, but I'd really started becoming a Star Trek fan, and really enthusiastic and passionate. After that, I saw in a comic book shop called Captain Comics, which is nearby, near where I lived. There was a pocket-sized book called Best of Trek 13, and these were books that were republications of articles by fans that were originally published in Trek Magazine. Essentially, Trek Magazine was a fan-made magazine, and I don't know how many issues there were, but it was basically articles written by Star Trek fans on topics such as what's the philosophy in Star Trek, how does the technology work, character biographies, trying to figure out the timeline, how would a warp drive work, articles like that. So, in one of these, in Best of Trek 13, it was a reaction, a response article to an earlier article, apparently in Best of Trek number 7, which itself had been previously published in some Trek magazine issue. They were about timelines, and it was going through step by step trying to figure out the timeline and the years and so forth. So I had already had that, and that I did a version of that myself. So blah blah blah. I haven't gone back to wherever that article is. I'm sure I would have saved it somewhere, but this is my new article, so to speak. All right, let's go back to the beginning. All right, so Gene Roddenberry was creating the show. In his writer's pitch, he hadn't established what time period Star Trek would be set in. He didn't want to be tied down to a specific year. Presumably, he didn't want to be tied down to a specific year because it would. If we had reached that point, people would say, "Oh, well, it's 1999, and how come we don't have that yet?" Star Trek would start looking artificial. But if you set it in some ambiguous time period, then you could say, "Oh, well, it's sometime in the future," and you could still. I mean, the shows are worthwhile in their own sense, but you wouldn't have that discrepancy of it being set in a timeline that we already are in reality. So he started off by saying the year could be 1999 the year could be 1995 or even 2995. In other words, close enough to our era that we would recognize these people as humans, but be far enough in the future so that people could walk around in shirt sleeve environments, meaning walk around in spaceships without needing breathing masks and without it looking like it came out of 2001: A Space Odyssey. So, which interestingly came out after the TV series, but anyway, as a movie. Anyway, so he didn't want to be tied down. However, so he creates the cage, which is the pilot episode, and from what I've read, while making the cage pilot, now let me describe what a pilot is. A TV pilot is not necessarily the first episode to air, but it's a test episode of a TV series that you want to produce. It's a sample. It's hypothetically, if I were to come up with a show called Policeman, and or let's call it Cyborg Man, you create a pilot episode that has your main cast introduced and a typical adventure that Cyborg Man would be involved in, and the role that you have is of a showrunner or executive producer, and hopefully with enough backing and clout and background in terms of a resume that you have some push, and you can be able to network it towards being produced. So you first of all, you pitch the TV show, and then the production company, the producers, say, "Oh yeah, that sounds interesting enough. We will invest some of our money in order to have you produce your pilot." So a pilot is filmed, it's cast, the sets are constructed, and presumably you are fitting in there scenes which would require the routine sets that you would need for the course of the series, and you are introducing the regular cast that you will need for the continuing cast you will need for the series. You produce the pilot, and then you show the pilot to the executives, and they say, "Oh, that looks good," or "No, we may change a few things," or "We don't like this character. We think you should change that character to another character," stuff like that. They start, this is their feedback. There's a term I'm forgetting in terms of screenwriting, but you present your product and then they start nitpicking and they say, oh, we don't like this, we think this will do better, and they start rewriting your stuff. But anyway, no, kidding aside, um, hopefully they say, okay, we will produce your then we will produce we like your episode, and then now it comes time to pitch it to the networks. So going back to Star Trek, what Gene Roddenberry had done was gone to Desilu and pitched his idea for Star Trek as a wagon train to the stars. Wagon Train was a popular Western at the time. Westerns were big at the time. So he pitched it to Desilu. Then they gave him a certain amount of money, and he created this pilot, which shifted the name. The name shifted. It shifted between the menagerie and the cage. And in fact, at one point, one of the characters says, a menagerie, a zoo, and anyway, blah, blah, blah. So that pilot was then seen by he pitched it to the different networks, and they said no, CBS said, oh, we already have Lost in Space. I think they already have Lost in Space by that point. This is according to David Gerrold, who wrote the making of book called The Trouble with Tribbles, about the famous episode. CBS said, oh no, we already have Lost in Space. And ABC apparently didn't want it. So NBC said, yes, this they were willing to accept it, and they bought it as a TV series. So Desilu was producing the episodes, and then it would go to NBC. NBC was the national broadcasting company that put it on the air, broadcast it. So, and of course, NBC was promoting the fact that it's in color, because at that time you still had people watching on black and white TV sets, and color was a big thing, and they probably wanted to sell color TVs and so forth. So that's why one of the reasons why when you see the original series, they have all sorts of different colors. Plus, it was the 1960s, and color was a neat feature in TV. They were just coming out of virtually all of it being in black and white. Now you're starting to see color. Anyway, getting back to this. Okay, so they produced the first pilot. They said, well, we like it, but we think you need more action, and sort of a bunch of different nitpicks that fans know about. So they produce so Gene Roddenberry works on a second pilot, and this is, by the way, not really unheard of to have a second pilot produced. Fans have sometimes said, oh, it's unprecedented that they made a second pilot. No. There have been other shows that have had that second pilots being made, and then that sells the show. Anyway, going back to the timeline, so he gathers together production staff and production people and consults writers, science fiction writers, to come work on the show or contribute to the show. And one of them is Samuel A. Peoples, who would write the next episode, the second pilot, called Where No Man Has Gone Before. And there's a description, I don't know how accurate it is, but there's an article I found on Star Trek factcheck.blogspot.com, which says that Gene Roddenberry and Samuel A. Peoples were sitting down drinking and chuckling, and they were trying to figure out the Stardate system. So the Stardate system, that was a clever idea. Gene Roddenberry didn't want to be tied down to a specific calendar year, like 1997 or 2195 or something, because at some point as we approach that time, it would seem unrealistic. So he wanted to be forever in the future, presumably. So an alternate way of doing it would just be create a new system of measuring time, a new calendar system. And somewhere in there, the idea of using just a Julian day system crept in, and let me see. Callum DeForest was a technical advisor on the Star Trek production alongside Harvey Lynn, Lynn, from the Research and Development Corporation, or RAND Corporation. And they, if you look up RAND Corporation, it's a fascinating company. And he was paid $50 per episode as like essentially a technical advisor, I believe. So the final draft of The Cage that Gene Roddenberry had written is dated November 20th, 1964. It has no star date, and in fact, if you see the actual episode, there's not even a captain's log. Although the captain refers to essentially, in so many words, refers to a captain's log. He takes out like an old style pad, and he just starts writing or looking at it. And he says, I want to log the doctor's opinion too. So there was a sense of a captain's log, but no reference was made to a specific date. That was November 20th, 1964, and the first draft of Where No Man Has Gone Before, the second pilot, is dated May 27th, 1965, and that includes 1312.4, I believe. And that's the first reference, apparently, to a stardate. Now, it's a little ambiguous who came up with it, but the idea is basically this. What I mean by Julian day is something that it's been said astronomers use. I don't know how accurate that is, but Joseph Justus, Justus Scalinger, Scalinger, developed it and named it after his father. I thought it was after the Romans, but apparently it's after his father, Julius Caesar Scaliger. What a name. Imagine going through school with a name like Julius Caesar. Anyway, for some bizarre reason, it's a no. He started that calendar system. I don't want to call it calendar system. He started that numerical system with the year 4713 BC. Actually, January 1st of the year 4713 BC. I have no idea why. Anyway, so with every day that goes by, you add a number. It sequentially increments forward 1 unit. So it's simply basically counting the number of days since the first, the day one. So it's like day 365, day 529, day 780 or whatever. So, in a memo, it says from, I believe, the RAND Corporation, or Callum DeForest, not sure which. There was some bizarre, really long string of numbers suggesting a year, a date, a current date, and I'm presuming it seems that Gene Roddenberry liked that idea, but just threw out any reaction that the company made, suggestion that the company made to change the term stardate to Julian B 1312.4. He just stuck with stardate. So, and that's how the series actually seems to have gone. If you watch the series, I will get into this. Each unit is a day, a 20. I don't know about 24-hour period, but a new day. And there was some talk I found about how the numbers would go down depending on the order of the episodes you're watching. The star dates would shift up and down. Apparently there was no strict setup for the star dates as they're assigned. It was basically pick 4 numbers, write them into your script, pick 4 numbers, and that will go with that. I think, however, I remember reading that there was somebody trying to, either officially or unofficially, I'm inclined to think kind of quasi officially, trying to keep consistency with the episodes and their star dates. Um, Within each episode, the star dates obviously increase, increment forward. So I'm thinking that in the series overall, if you were going to uh, put them in any sort of order in terms of a timeline, you have to pay attention to the star dates. This is what I did in elementary school. I remember this. There was a Apple IIc, may have been an Apple IIc computer. Anyway, I would borrow time at the library, and I would create an Excel spreadsheet, and I would have the episode titles, and I would have the star dates. And I was really proud of myself. This is when I was in grade school, maybe fifth or sixth grade, uh, and I was really proud. I would have these, and I would remember the star dates, partly because I had the Star Trek Compendium by Alan Asherman, and sometimes he was a little dyslexic with the star date numbers. But anyway, all right. So, uh, Where No Man Has Gone Before has 1312 and then to 1313.8. And so that should be really 24 hours or really almost 2 days. There's a number of interesting things in that episode. You have Kirk's birthday, Kirk's birth. You have a tombstone created, and you have um, uh, the one who was intending to kill him creates a tombstone, and it has one start date here, and then a hyphen, and then 1313.8, I believe, 1313 point something, and so somebody noted that that would make Kirk only like 30 something days old, and that can't be right. So if I remember correctly, in that article on Star Trek factcheck.blogspot.com, they were suggesting an earlier number system or a different number system or whatever, but apparently that was rejected, and this was used 12 da 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 dash 1313.8, I believe, and they just stuck with that. That's how the episode shows, and also, you have two birth dates. You have one for the character of Dr. Daner, and you have one for Gary Mitchell. And those seem to follow that same thing, where it's like they had to fit in some number in there, but they couldn't go back too far. So I think it's like 10 something something for birth date. Maybe 1071. I have to check that. But even that probably doesn't add up to uh, something like 20 something years, which was what it should be. But I wanted to mention it was in there. So you have uh, you have some kind of counting system. All right. So things go along. The first time you actually get some sense of anything as to when the series is set is Tomorrow Was Yesterday. And by the way, I'm going in production order. Tomorrow Was Yesterday. Kirk and company are accidentally transported back in time to the 1960s. Yes, it has to be the 1960s specifically because they hear a news report that the moonshot will be Wednesday, um, Wednesday night, the next Wednesday, and Spock's and Kirk says, "Well, that was in the late 1960s," and Spock says, "Apparently, Captain, so are we." And keep in mind, this aired, I think, in the beginning of something like January 1967, and it was pretty prophetic. I know there was a movement. I'm curious actually how well aware people were of the status of the efforts to land on the moon, but in 1967, but they barely made. I mean, NASA barely made it. They, I think it was July 20th or July 19th, something like July something. 1969, and President Kennedy, all the way back in I think 1961 or 62, said, "I believe this nation should commit itself to landing a man on the moon and returning him safely to the Earth." I'm slightly paraphrasing there. And they barely made it with only a few months to spare. Anyway, so they are apparently accidentally thrown back in time to clearly 1969 or the 1960s in general. Now, Kirk becomes captured, and one of the I think he's a sergeant, Air Force sergeant. He says, "I'm going to lock you up for 200 years," and then Kirk smirks and he says, "Yep, that'll be just about right," implying that Star Trek is set 200 years in the future. All right, so then Space Seed is interesting. That Tomorrow's Yesterday is episode in production order. Counting the Cage is the first one, and the Menagerie, the two-part Menagerie episode, as one episode, episode 16. Tomorrow's Yesterday is the 22nd episode. And then the 25th episode is Space Seed. Now, there's something interesting. I didn't dig through when I was making these notes. I didn't dig through, but I remember that the first draft of... I remember reading that the first draft, the draft before it was all changed, or perhaps it was the outline, was for Space Seed, was saying that Khan had come. He wakes up from a cryogenic freeze. He's put in a cryogenic freeze, a sleeper ship, and then he's awakened in this new century, new time, and he comes from the 21st century. That may play a part in this, but it was changed. 21st century, for some reason, was changed to 1990s, and in the final episode, they actually give, this may be the first time when they actually give dates. Spock says from 1992 through 96, Khan was ruler of more than a quarter of your world, from Asia through the Middle East. And so 1996 presumably is when he and his the others. It's interesting, actually. As a slight side note, Spock says that something like 80 of these genetically bred Supermen who took power all around the world began fighting with themselves. And then when World War III ends in 1996, presumably, there were some 80 or 90 Supermen that had not been accounted for. And that's very interesting in terms of us, especially considering when the episode aired. This would have been 20 years after the Second World War. Kirk says that fact isn't in the history books. And then Spock says, would you spread the news to war-weary populations that some 80 or 90 Napoleons may still be alive? So I get the impression, and of course there's 72, it's specifically referenced that 72 people were in this cryogenic ship. Must have been a big ship, by the way, actually, come to think of it. Not this little dinky, it must have been a big ship to hold 72. But anyway, 72 were still alive, and they awakened. So that implies, I've always had this impression that it wasn't just Khan, he was one of the rulers during World War III, but these other ones weren't just followers of his, they would have been rulers ruling around the world. So some of them may have been actually in rivalry with each other, which is not brought about in the episode because it's focusing on Khan, and these are almost background characters. They're treated like followers of him, but because he's instructing them, but that didn't seem to jive, because wouldn't these also be genetic Supermen? Would these be rulers around the rest of the world? Anyway, it doesn't quite make sense. But anyway, all right, I'm getting off point. So 1996. So that's when he goes to sleep and he is in cryogenic freeze. So, and then Kirk says in the episode, he answers Khan by saying, "You've been asleep by, we estimate, 2 centuries, maybe more." So if it's about 200 years or 2 centuries, if you're counting it as a 20th century, then it would be the 22nd century. So, all right, then you come to the Savage Curtain. Now, this is way, 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 way towards the end of the third and final season. This is just a few episodes before the whole series ends. You have, I'll just say, an illusion of Abraham Lincoln. And Scotty references somebody who's been dead for 300 years. So Abraham Lincoln was alive in 1860s. So he was a century before we were watching the series. So so that jives with what I've just established. If it's the 19th century and we're watching in the 20th century, we're still putting Star Trek 200 years in the future, and Lincoln lived a century before us. So that 300-year thing adds up. It's 100 years plus the 200 years equals 300 years. So that's consistent. There are some weird, I must mention, there are some weird inconsistencies in this 200-year thing, 22nd century setting for Star Trek. One is where no man has gone before, and you can't really blame them for that because it was way, 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 way back, beginning of the series. But there's a talk about the SS Valiant, which was an Earth ship, which was lost at the edge of the galaxy. Of course, you have to make all sorts of weird workarounds how it could get all the way that far. But Kirk says it's established that it was lost almost 200 years ago. Kirk, in fact, says that in his speech to the crew. The SS Valiant was lost almost 200 years ago. And I remember in the Corbomite maneuver, the next episode produced, and officially the beginning of the production of the series itself, that he says, since the beginning of space exploration, more than 2 of our centuries ago, so it's unclear whether he includes the 20th century NASA projects in that, or whether he really means since the early days of space exploration. Does that mean that it includes NASA, or does that really mean, really higher tech space exploration out to the stars? It's unclear. Anyway, the other episode that is an annoyance to this 22nd century thing is Squire of Gothos. The Enterprise visits a planet that's, I think it's like 900 light years away. Now, you may know what a light year is. A light year is, since light travels at the speed of light and it's a constant, it would go at the speed of light. I mean, light would travel at the speed of light. So at a certain, I think it's 300,000 kilometers per second. If I remember correctly, it's 186,282 miles per second. I think 186,282. So, which is really fast. And you get into relativity theory if you try and go faster, and you for specific physics problems, you can't go faster than light. Star Trek has this warp drive system where it folds and distorts space so that you can apparently travel without really going faster than light. You can jump to another system without having to travel all the way through. And that was kind of vague, very vague in the original series, and then afterwards they firmed it up and they tried to firm it up, and real scientists have tried to actually figure out how a warp drive would really work, and that's a discussion for a whole other video. all right. So they encounter this being, animated, very colorful character on this planet who has been using his telescope, and and then he refers to Napoleon. He refers to this crew that has come down and talks with him. He refers to Napoleon. He says how warlike these humans are, and he's fascinated by how warlike these humans are. And it's very clear in the dialogue that his information is out of date. In fact, Kirk says at one point, I don't know where you got your information, but you got it wrong. And he has his telescope. So it's very heavily implying that he's been seeing Earth through a telescope. So you have to account for the time that light would travel. So if the planet is 900 light years away, then, I just thought of something. A workaround. It's not mentioned in the episode, but okay, I'll mention this, and I'll mention the workaround. The only way you can make this possible, if the planet is 900 light years away and he's looking through a telescope, then Napoleon, having been maybe 800 light years away, Napoleon was a century before us as we're watching the TV show, and so you have to add that century in there. But anyway, you'd have to set Star Trek in something like the 28th century or 29th century. You know what I mean. Time has to reach his telescope. Time has to elapse to allow the light from 800 or 900 light years away to reach his telescope so that he can see it. Now, in saying so, I just realized something. It doesn't have to have been Gothos, that planet. He could have been watching from a different planet. I mean, it's heavily... You get the impression that he was watching them through that telescope on that planet. But if he had been watching from a planet closer to Earth, you would not require those 9 centuries or whatever for the light to travel to his telescope from Earth. I guess that's a workaround. Anyway, it's not quite not retconning, but anyway, so those are the two inconsistencies. For the rest of the series, however, it kept saying 200 years, 200 years in the few episodes which actually reference time. Now, there were 2 books that came out after the end of the 2nd season and before the production began on the 3rd season. There was some shifting around. I think that was the time also when Desilu was bought out by Paramount. And then Paramount came in, and there were some heavy changes made, staff-wise and policy-wise and so forth. They're now under a different house. Paramount now owns Star Trek. Anyway, then the 3rd season came out and so forth. So anyway, The Making of Star Trek book by Gene Roddenberry and Stephen Whitfield, and a 2nd book by James Blish. Who is James Blish? This was a time, I remember, before VCRs, I don't want to say existed, but I mean, right, really, before anybody really mainstream America had access to these episodes whenever they wanted to watch them. And so fans only had photographs and maybe audio cassette, the idea of the Walkman, I think, came out in the 1970s when the Japanese really started to shrink technology down, and you could have a small cassette player and so forth. But I think it was reel-to-reel tape recorders, these large reel-to-reels. And if you could afford them, you could be able to record only the audio of these episodes. Maybe if you had some weird high-tech, if you had enough money, if you had some high-tech setup, maybe you could film the screen, the TV screen or something like that. But there were no VCRs. You couldn't just stream it. You couldn't, whatever. So keep that in mind for you youngins out there. So The Making of Star Trek may have been the first book about Star Trek, The Making of Star Trek. The first anything about Star Trek that was really about the production of it. And so going back to James Blish, so he would take the scripts, and he would make narrative stories based on the scripts. So I have a few of these books. He would he published he published the episodes. They weren't, and then he bound them in books in book form. And I don't think the binding, the collections match the production order. He would number each book. It was like Star Trek 1, Star Trek 2, Star Trek 10, Star Trek 12, or whatever. But I think the episodes were kind of mishmashed. So so in 1968, there were two books. James Blish's book that includes the narrative adaptation of Space Seed and The Making of Star Trek. Now, I have The Making of Star Trek, and it says the 23rd, somewhere in there, it says Star Trek is set in the 23rd century. This is actually something that fascinated me, and I haven't really delved into it. When did this deviate? Like, who said 23rd century? Where did that come from? If the previous episodes had been consistently talking about the 22nd century. And then, of course, James Blish sets it in the 23rd century as well. Maybe The Making of Star Trek, maybe there was some correspondence between the two authors. I don't know. Then the third season comes out, and so forth. And so then you have the animated series in between, which is 22 episodes, and maybe there's a reference to the 23rd century somewhere. So then the motion picture comes out 10 years after the end of the series in 1979, December 7th, 1979, according to Alan Asherman's Star Trek Compendium. And not sure if that's, no, it doesn't say the 23rd century at the beginning, but at the climax, it makes reference to 300 years ago, NASA launching, I won't go into detail to avoid spoilers as if I haven't already, but anyway, it references NASA having done something 300 years ago, and then it specifically mentions the 23rd century, this being the 23rd century. So, again, that's the first reference now, the 23rd century. Now we're in the movie era. The TV series is gone 10 years prior. And then the next movie, The Wrath of Khan, starts off in the beginning with a text appearing in the 23rd century. And I remember listening to the audio commentary. Yes, I do. You get interesting tidbits sometimes with these audio commentaries. Nicholas Meyer, who had been the director of the movie, said that he put in the audio commentary, he put it in there to tell his mother, if I remember correctly, when the movie is set. It's like with any movie. Sometimes you don't know when the movie is set. You need some kind of keyword, some chyron to say 1985 or 1976 or something. So he put in the 23rd century. And that movie is also interesting in that it mentions a specific year. I'm not going to say that the original series didn't mention years. The Wolf in the Fold specifically mentions a year, like it was a past year. It was like 21 something or other. So apparently Star Trek, or at least that episode, is set after that year, clearly. But there were no, other than that, and the reference to 2018 being when space travel had advanced in the past to a point of being able to reach another star system within someone's lifetime. There weren't really years mentioned in the original series. But in this one, Star Trek II, The Wrath of Khan, Bones gives Kirk a bottle of ale, Romulan ale, and Kirk looks at it and says, ooh, 2283. And then Bones says, well, it takes a while for the stuff to ferment. So that's the implication of that is that the movie is set quite a few years after 2283. Which doesn't jibe with what I found. But anyway, then you get I don't think there's anything referenced in Star Trek 3, The Search for Spock, but in Star Trek 4, The Voyage Home, Kirk specifically says to Dr. Jillian Taylor, no, I come from what on your calendar would be the late 23rd century. So it's consistent. The movies say 23rd century, 23rd century. So it's interesting. It's like the TV series is 22nd century, and then all of a sudden, 23rd for the movies, 23rd century consistently. What made it go whoop like that? I still wonder about that. And I am... All right, so what century? I should go back a little bit and mention specifically about star dates. I mentioned they increase, if you watch a TV series, they're consistent. They made the episodes, if you put them in star date order, the episodes in star date order, you may notice a discrepancy between the production order and the air date order and the star date order. Simply because probably an episode may have been assigned a specific star date and they filmed it, but due to special effects creeping in and whoops, we can't get the episode produced on time and so forth and so on, the episodes just couldn't be placed in star date order. So, I hope I don't get, I hope this isn't naughty for YouTube, but screw it, right? Just air the episode. All right, fine, the star dates are out of order. And in fact, Gene Roddenberry said, well, the star dates are out of order because you have to correct for time dilation and the placement in the location relative to the center of the galaxy or location within the galaxy or something. I think that was basically him saying, forget it. I didn't expect people to pay this close attention to star dates. But within each episode, they were pretty clear. There's one episode, Spock's Brain, that I think goofs and actually goes backwards in terms of stardate order, but that's Spock's Brain has a number of weird things with that episode. But within an episode, it increments by units, and specifically I want to point to the episodes Miri and The Conscience of the King as very clear. I think the Galileo 7 as well. Yeah, Galileo 7 as well. If you notice, like in terms of how many days they have left and the stardate's units increasing, it's very clear. And it was mentioned, it's been explained this way in the Writer's Guide for Star Trek, both the original series and the Next Generation. It's a 4-digit number, and there's a decimal point, and then there's one or two numbers after, usually one number after that. Now, you have the string of numbers. The number before the decimal point, you have a string of numbers, and then you have a decimal point. The number before the decimal point is the change from that to a new number. 1 unit change equals a day. And then there's the decimal point, and then after that, it's clearly a decimal point, which would be 0 all the way up to 9, and then it goes to 0 again. Clearly, it's a tenth of a day. So you can imagine if you were to just list star dates in order, they're the number of days since number 1, whatever date that is, 1.0. It's just accumulating. So in my mind, I thought, wow, that's kind of weird. So that would mean that you would have like 1,000 units in a year or something. Like if the first episode is 1312, and then the final episode of this 5-year mission, and the opening of the series, the opening that airs for each episode of the original series says it's 5-year mission. It's 5-year mission. The earliest one, where no man has gone before, the one with the earliest star date, is 1312, and then All Our Yesterdays or Turnabout Intruder is 59 something or other. Then that means it's like 5,000 something units equaling 5 years, and that's really way off. So So I guess you just have to say that there were gaps or jumps in terms of time. If you keep with this idea that the star dates increase are just naturally flowing, increasing in order, and don't go with the well, you have to measure it against the location in space or whatever. Um, I can't see how you could have a system like that. And then in other episodes, they refer back to earlier star dates, and it just becomes messy unless you have a consistent increasing system, incrementing system. So you just have to allow for that. Now, I wondered if, well, all right, some people suggest that what you had seen in these 3 years didn't cover 5 years. What you see in the 3 years were really either the first 3 years of this 5 year mission, or maybe it was the entire 5 years. Originally, I thought of it as perhaps being the entire 5 years just aired in 3 years work over the course of 3 years, where you could have like um, once with star dates one as the first of the 4 digits being the first year, and then two da 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 two, and then 3 digits being the second year, three and then 3 digits being the third, and then four or whatever, and then five and then 3 digits being the fifth year. I thought that would be interesting, and then after a long while, I finally felt convinced. No, it's really screwy. Um, if you want to remain consistent with real-time production of the series, it was clear that the intent was to air the show for 5 years, and that each season would be equivalent to a year. So I looked through the star dates, and that holds up pretty well. If you put the episodes in star date order and you divide, you find, and then you mark them off by which season they aired in. It's pretty consistent. There may be more episodes in one year than another year, but you could have 3 seasons equaling 3 years worth. Clearly, they were intending to have 2 more seasons, and then who knows what after that. So that's how I see it. Had they gone on to a fourth and fifth season, the numbers would have kept increasing and increasing. So, fortunately, it holds up that way. All right, now that I've established star dates, I will go on to constructing a timeline without a specific date. Okay, so this is kind of the fun part, perhaps the easier part. We start with you, so we don't have any date to fix this on, but we want to construct a timeline referring to how many years intervaled between different events. So you have Kirk's 5 year mission. In Star Trek: The Motion Picture, he says, "How do we, of course, how are we sure that he completed his 5 year mission?" Well, in Star Trek: The Motion Picture, which takes place afterwards, he says, "I have had 5 years of experience out there dealing with weird things like that." So that implies heavily, he that the series would have lasted, or at least he commanded the Enterprise for 5 years. Okay, so in that same movie, Captain Decker says, "You haven't logged a single star hour in 2.5 years." And earlier in the movie, Kirk says that being chief of Starfleet operations may have made him a little dry, but he doesn't exactly call himself unqualified. And that would mean that he had been chief of Starfleet operations for 2.5 years, and that jives with Decker saying you haven't logged a single star hour in 2.5 years. So he would have been promoted after commanding the Enterprise for 5 years. He would have been promoted to chief of Starfleet operations. Quite good, quite a good promotion. That'd be equivalent, I guess, to chief of naval operations, today's universe. And then the motion picture takes place. So you have 5 years, and then you have his promotion to chief of Starfleet operations, and that lasts for 2.5 years. And then during the final part of that 2.5 years, the Enterprise is refurbished and new technologies put in. So you're still talking about that same Enterprise ship, but it's been the new technology's been uh, put in, has been retrofitted, and so forth. So for 18 months. So it's 5 years, then 2.5 years, and then Star Trek: The Motion Picture. Um, and then you jump ahead to the second movie, which is The Wrath of Khan. Now, Kirk says that he hasn't seen Khan in 15 years. And Khan was in the first season of the original series. So there would be 15 years between Space Seed and The Wrath of Khan. Now, there's some implication, like in The Wrath of Khan, remember there's that reference to the Romulan ale being dated 2283, and this being sometime after that. So you're almost into the 24th century, really. There's some sense of time. So that gives you some sense of time. We can't pin down an exact year for The Wrath of Khan, but it must be sometime after 2283. And then Star Trek: The Search for Spock. Now there's a discrepancy here. Somebody says the Enterprise is 20 years old. Okay. I don't know where the 20-year... I have a guess as to why he said 20 years. Star Trek: The Search for Spock came out in 1984, and the original series came out in 1966. Actually, The Cage was filmed in 1964. So they may have been basing it just on the existence of the show. And it's not that uncommon. But if you actually paid attention to the internal Star Trek chronology, you would know that in The Menagerie, which aired in the first season, there's a reference to, remember I mentioned The Cage. Now, The Cage was the first pilot. All right, I don't want to confuse you. In The Menagerie, set in season 1, Kirk says that Spock had served with his previous captain, Captain Pike, for 11 years, 4 months, 5 days. Let's just call it 11 and a half years. And then within that same episode, you see events. It's a clip show. It's a cleverly inventive clip show, but it's a clip show. You see scenes from the earlier episode, and he says this is 13 years ago in that same episode. All right, so in that Menagerie, it's showing clips from The Cage. Now, remember, The Cage was the first pilot before they filmed the second pilot, Where No Man Has Gone Before and sold the series. The first pilot, The Cage, had Spock and then had a totally different crew. And then they changed the crew for the second pilot, and then that was more. That second pilot looks closer, and it was close enough to actually air as part of the series, the TV series. The first episode the crew looks very different. So remember, in this first season episode, The Menagerie, Spock says, these events took place 13 years ago. It's interesting. 13 years. So in that same episode, Kirk says that Spock served with Pike for 11 and a half years. So, let me see. So it's 13 years ago, and then you have 13 years between The Cage and The Menagerie, and then somehow, I don't remember the exact math, but I remember that would place The Cage at the beginning of his 11 and a half years, which would make sense because if this was a pilot for a new TV series, obviously you're going to set it at the beginning or near in the first year of Pike's mission. Somehow, the math sort of adds up. It's pretty clear if you do it. And then let me see, The Menagerie. All right, so you have 11 years under Pike, and then if you want to include this, there was an animated episode that aired between the original series and the movies. The final episode, in fact, it's called The Counterclock Incident, and it shows the first captain of the Enterprise, Captain Robert April. and I don't remember if they reference how many years he was serving. It's been said like 4 years or something like that. But he would have been before Pike. Then you have Pike, and then you have Kirk. So um, even if you ignore April, you still have 11 years for Pike, and then 5 years for Kirk. So that's uh, okay. Wow, this is still recording. Oh my gosh. Okay. For those of you still watching, my screensaver went on. Okay. Phew. All right. So you have 11 years. You have 11 years and 5 years. That's 16 years. And then, so 16 years by the time the original series, the Kirk's 5 year mission is over, and then you have 10 years between the first season of the original series and the Wrath of Khan. So you have to allow at least several years. So it goes beyond 20 years. It's closer to 30 years. And so that 20-year thing is erroneous, or it's a mistake. Doesn't jibe. Uh, all right, so then nothing else in the search for Spock. Um, and then the voyage home. I don't think there's anything to mention. And then the next generation. Okay, so after the voyage home, the fourth movie came out. They started producing the next TV series, aside from the animated series, the next the second live action TV series of Star Trek, called Star Trek: The Next Generation. And when is it set? There is in the press release, I believe it said it's set 78 years after the days of Kirk and Spock. I don't know what defines the days of Kirk and Spock, 78 years, or where that 78-year thing comes from. But the commercials and the trailer, and I believe in the actual first season of the TV show for the Next Generation, it says 24th century. So clearly, this is a century before. It's marking the original series as the 23rd century, and the days of Kirk and Spock being the 23rd century. So we had to watch a whole season until you reach the season finale, which is the neutral zone, and you have people from the 20th century waking up, and one of them asks, well, what year is it? And Data, the android crew member, says, by your calendar, it would be the year 2364. So we finally have a date. This, incidentally, doesn't jibe with the premiere episode of The Next Generation, Encounter at Farpoint, which Data says that he was a member of the class of 78, presumably 2378. And in a later episode, Data lore, it's established that he was activated 26 years ago. So it couldn't be 2278. It's got to be 2378. So already that's a little inconsistent. So we'll just drop the class of 78 reference. Apparently the production of the Next Generation has as well. So 2364 would be year one. And this time they pinned down, or at least there was more of an effort to pin down star dates. The star dates did sometimes shift, like their episodes were a little out of order in terms of star dates, leading to one of the main characters being killed off. I won't give out which one, but one of the main characters being killed off, and then but there were episodes before that that had a later. There was at least one episode, I think, The Big Goodbye, that had featured the character in it that is set Stardate wise after the person's death. So that's a little scary. I guess she was a ghost in the other episode that nobody knew about, that she was a ghost, or she was reincarnated for that one episode or something. And then starting with season 2, I noticed something. It had been established from the very beginning. Remember, I said there are 4 digits in the original series. The Stardate formula has 4 digits, and they increment day by day by day by day. Well, in the Next Generation, they decided to have the first digit be the season, and that each season would be equivalent to a different year. So the first number would indicate the season or the year of Picard's mission, and then you have the 4 digits. Now, to separate that from the original series, which had 4 digits, somebody decided to add a 4 at the beginning of it. So all the season 1 star dates would be 4-1, 4-1, and then 3 digits. And then towards the end of the season, it would be like 4-1, close to 9-9-9. And then the second season would begin 4-2, 0-0-0, all the way to 4-2, 9-9-9, and so forth, all the way through. And they've continued that system even after the 7 years of the Next Generation. When Voyager aired, they didn't start all the way from scratch. They didn't invent a new star date system. They just kept the star dates running, which further backs up the idea that star dates would simply increase over time. Somebody actually calculated. I think it was Mike Okuda and Denise Okuda, when they were creating the Star Trek chronology. There's a footnote saying they were just curious. Well, like, if this begins with 41 da 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 da, when is year 1? And I think it was something like 2336 or something like that, as when the year 1 would be. And they said, or it was typed, we don't know what significance that is, but apparently something started this new Stardate system from year 1 again. I don't know how far I want to take this. Okay, so we go back to the original series, because okay, so there's a key episode in the 3rd season of the Next Generation. Sarek says that somebody says that Sarek is 202 years old, and in Journey to Babel, it said that, or he himself says that he's 102.437 years old, as measured in your calendar. So clearly, there's exactly 100 years between Journey to Babel and the episode Sarek in the 3rd season, give or take, depending on when his birth date had already happened, or whether it's approaching soon or what. But as 100 years. So I was working with that, and remember, I had done this in 1991 or early 92, something like that, in the early 90s, after having seen Star Trek The Undiscovered Country, because there's a reference to, first of all, in that movie, there's a reference to the Klingon Earth schism, or unfriendly relations, being 70 years old, unremitting hostility being 70 years old. And in The Day of the Dove, which aired in season 3 of the original series, they refer to, I don't remember, something similar, like hostilities with the Klingons being 50 years. I wonder if that at the time, if that was a pretty direct reference to the Cold War between the United States and the Soviet Union. If you take 1960 and 1966, or actually even better, if you take 1968 and you subtract 50 years, you get 1918, which is right around when the Soviet when the Soviet Union, when that area officially became the Soviet Union, essentially. Um, the Russian Revolution, back to the Russian Revolution. I wonder if that was on purpose. Um, there's also the timeline in terms of the crew biographies themselves. I want to focus on Spock. In the Enterprise incident, which is the third season, um, the Romulan commander asks him, "How long have you been a Starfleet officer?" And he says there's something about commissioning. So he says 18 years. Now that was in the third season. So if you take 4 years at the academy, assuming he had 4 years at the academy, and then um, there's the 11 years, 11 and a half years with Pike, and then the 5 years with Kirk. And let's see, oh, actually 3 years. Let's be careful, 3 years because, or maybe 2 and something years with Kirk because this is in the third season. The 5 years hasn't, all 5 years haven't elapsed yet. So you have 4 plus 11 and a half, 15, and then 3 years would be 18 years. So he was, and Spock would not have, Spock is Vulcan, he would not have averaged or been inaccurate about how many years have gone by. It seems like he was very accurate. He just merely left out the number of months. It would have been 18 years and some months because remember you have to allow for that 4 months 5 days thing from the 11 years. So it's 4 years plus 11 years 4 months 5 days. So that's so many. It's 15 years, right? 15 years, 11 years, 15 years, 4 months, 5 days, and then 3 years. This is towards the end of the third season, end of the third year, or beginning of the third year. He's pretty close, anyway. I guess he's pretty close to 18 years. So he was right. So he's presumably including 4 years at the academy. So this has been pretty long. I guess I should do a part 2, and I'll talk to you next time. Bye.